welcome to Talking Youth Work. My name is Anita Silva, and together with Rui Branco, we interview experts and practitioners that have a say when it comes to innovation in youth work. This current series is funded by the project Inception of Learning, that is funded by the European Commission through the Erasmus Plus Youth Key Action 2 projects. This project aims to support youth workers, trainers, and educators in delivering quality learning experiences in the field of youth in the context of Generation Z and Generation Alpha. In this episode, we talked with Romy Alexandra. She is an amazing facilitator, a learning experience designer, and a psychological safety trainer. We were talking exactly about that, psychological safety in learning environments. So we try to define the concept and how it interacts, how it intersects with non-formal learning, with experiential learning, and with youth work at large. We also covered some of the most common misconceptions around psychological safety in education settings. And it was very interesting to reflect about this notion that sometimes we have that we want the group to feel well, happy, comfortable, but safety can and must exist within discomfort, conflict, confrontation, within a range of diverse cultural behaviors. So for us, it was an amazing talk. We hope you enjoy it as well too. And with no further ado, let's talk youth work. Hi, dears. Nice to have you here today. Hi, Rui. Hi, Romy. Welcome.
Thank you. So nice to be here.
Hello. Nice to be with you.
Well, let's start with our short recollection of where we are connecting from today. I'm in Lisbon. Rui, where are you?
Near Lisbon. I'm in Carcavelos. I don't
Romy,
move. I'm a tree.
I just got back to Stuttgart, Germany, so that's where I am today.
Very well. And I know this is where you are based currently, but that has not always been like that. So I go straight to the point. Could you share a bit about your professional journey, which probably also mingles a bit with your personal journey, and what led you to focus on psychological safety and experiential learning?
Sure, yes. So I'm originally from New York City, although at this point I feel more European than I feel American. I've spent the greater part of the last 15 years in Eastern, Western, now Central Europe. And I'm very grateful because my whole journey in youth work, experiential learning, psychological safety, it all actually stemmed from the Republic of Moldova. So I spent 2.5 years way back when, living in Moldova, working as a Peace Corps volunteer. And so what I was in charge of really was I lived in a small village and was working with different NGOs focused on youth development and community development initiatives. And my focus was actually, I had a big passion in addressing human rights topics like human trafficking prevention. And so I really was working on youth leadership development and human trafficking prevention, which brought me to the world of experiential learning because I realized very early on, I was working with different organizations who had life-saving information, and we were going into schools and watching these lecture presentations on how youth could protect themselves from methods traffickers use, these kind of things, but it was going in one ear and out the other. And I realized, wait, this information is too important. We need to figure out how do we make people remember. And that really took me on a journey into experiential learning to understand how our brains actually learn the best. And not just to make it engaging, interactive, and fun, but also really effective and to encourage sustained change over time. And throughout the years in my journey to really learn more from David and Alice Kolb and the Institute for Experiential Learning on what is really the theory, that brought me to psychological safety because I realized it is the foundation for learning. You can't create real spaces where people can be vulnerable and say, I don't know, and ask a stupid question or try and, fail forward, do something, never having done it before, totally mess up, but then really, instead of feeling shamed, really be able to extract learning from it? Or how do we create space where everyone feels included and so they feel they can bring themselves more into the learning space? So very early on in my journey to dive deep into experiential learning, I learned psych safety is the foundation. We need it, and haven't stopped since. So that's kind of what brought me here today.
And before we start recording, you were just telling us that you also do a lot of training for youth workers. What kind of trainings are you delivering these days on youth work?
Yeah, I think so. Over the years, I'm trying to keep them short and succinct, but over the years, what I realized is that in my ability to work better with youth, to design these experiential and safer learning spaces, that there was a lot of learning that could be valid for any youth worker across it. I think this is the beauty of the topics of what I'm so passionate about, is that it doesn't matter if you're a trainer or a youth worker on business or psychology or sports. These are universal approaches and processes and methods that are so valid. So I did a lot of work over the years in Erasmus Plus, many training courses on emotional intelligence and training of trainers on experiential learning and human rights work. But more recently, over the years, I've also started to expand, thank you, COVID, expand our geographic boundaries across the globe. And most recently, actually, I had an opportunity to work with human rights defenders in exile. So they were no longer able to work within their country due to just a lot of the political situation, but they still wanted to make an impact with the youth that they were working with. So we did a lot of trainings on how do we integrate experiential learning and psychological safety into human rights education, but from abroad in a remote online format, which I do a lot now. So still, it will always be a part of me, youth work. I'm a youth worker at heart, and love continuing to expand and work with more people in the field.
And that sounds like a super powerful, impactful training right there, working with activists and human rights defenders in exile. That sounds very, very interesting. I would love to know more about that. I don't think we will have the time today to explore everything. So let me also help our listeners kind of frame the topic of today. How do you define psychological safety within learning environments, in the learning context, and how can that be relevant for youth work, for the youth work field?
Yeah, well, I'd say that the definitions I most often go back to is, first and foremost, Dr. Amy Edmondson. She's done a ton of research over the last 30 years in this and can really speak to the data. And I love how she says that psychological safety is a shared environment. So again, it's not something that just I feel, you feel, but it's what we share in a shared environment. It's a shared belief that one will not be punished for interpersonal risk-taking. And we talk about interpersonal risk-taking, that really means I know I won't be humiliated for speaking up with questions, concerns, or admitting my mistakes. Dr. Timothy Clark, he has a really nice, succinct definition as well, which basically says that it's an environment of rewarded vulnerability, in contrast to what you would imagine an environment of punished vulnerability, right? Like I admit a mistake, but I'm immediately going to, be in trouble for it. And you mentioned psych safety and learning. And I would argue that whether it's workplaces, learning spaces, it's the same sentiment is needed. This is a human need we have. We cannot really show up and bring our contributions. We talk so much about the youth work, how we need to co-create, we need to collaborate, we need to contribute more. But we can't create space for people to step in or, really bring more of themselves into the work if they don't feel that there's some kind of foundation for safety. And I think that's why it's just so essential before we dive into the work, really make sure we've set the stage and built the container so people then feel that they can really contribute their most.
I have a provocative question.
Great.
Because I was listening to you and I was thinking, is there a place where it's not a learning space? When I'm interacting with another human being or in an environment, I'm learning the rules of the environment. I'm learning the rules that my relationship has with those people that I interact with. So every place where we interact with someone or someone is a learning space.
I love your take on it, Hui, and I completely agree because we often talk about experiential learning. How we learn is how we live. This is the natural process that we go through, whether I am in non-formal education, formal education, informal, we're constantly going through the learning cycle. And you mentioned such a great point, like in conversations, I see this all the time. We might be having a one-to-one conversation and somebody mentions a name or an acronym or something. And in the past, I'd be too shy to say, I don't actually know what that means. Could you clarify? But sometimes you do like the head nod of like smile. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And then you're like, oh, I have no idea what he's talking about. Right. But you're absolutely right. That's a learning. You know what I'm talking about. But that's the thing is that's a learning space and a learning moment where I could say, hey, I actually don't know who that is. Could you tell me what that acronym stands for? Oh, I've never heard of that. That also takes a lot of courage, but also takes a safe space to say, hey, I'm admitting that I'm actually a little bit ignorant here.
Yeah, but the thing it has transfer because I learned that I could do that in a safe space. Now I do it even when the space is not that safe.
This is why we say it's a partnership, right? I think learning is a partnership and psychological safety also is a partnership because I also want to prevent that facilitators, trainers, youth workers feel that they have to carry the entire weight of creating a safe space for others, because you're absolutely right. It's going to take courage. It's going to take somebody speaking up and say, my needs are not met here, or I need to address something. Amy Edmondson has done a lot of research into what are the pillars, the needs of psychological safety, which we can talk about. But even within that, they're so broad. And each individual is coming in with their own background experience, their own needs, their own values, their own approaches. That this, I think, is why facilitation is so important. It's not about being the expert and saying, I know exactly what everyone needs here and I'm going to create safety. It's more about facilitating those conversations so people can bring them in, but also so we're creating that container.
Yes, I'm very aligned with what you just said, that sometimes I think in youth work, and I think this is also has to do with the identity, our professional identity as youth workers. Sometimes I think we tend to, swing between either not wanting to interfere at all, because our principle is one of learners' engagement, learners' self-directed learning, etc., or to take that responsibility very fully, that, if there's a conflict, if there's a disagreement, if somebody voices something out of what the group is kind of agreeing to, we kind of feel scared. We kind of feel like, oh my God, I'm failing here. So it's so interesting that you mentioned that. And I want to talk more about these common misconceptions about psychological safety. But before that, I'm always concerned about who is listening to us and how they understand these concepts. And I know the way this translates for many languages might feel short because we're talking about psychological safety. And I can hear in my head many youth workers saying, well, what about emotional safety and physical safety? So what are we talking about here? Are they different things? Are they all included in this concept? Tell us more about it.
That's such a great point. I'd say that I would argue, although I'm not an expert in deep into emotional safety, I haven't thought so much about it, but as someone who's done a lot of work in emotional intelligence, I see it very much as the same thing. I see it as here's what's interesting. Physical safety and psychological safety for me are very distinctly different, but they are very much still connected in the sense of when we think about physical safety, right? I'm making sure I'm not physically harmed here. I'm making sure that your physical needs are met within a space
I'm taking risks that I can handle.
Exactly. But the interesting thing of what a lot of research has shown is that psychological pain can often feel even more painful than physical pain or a physical injury. And this is why we need to attune to those emotional needs. We need to attune to that psychological needs that people will have. But it doesn't mean it's a fluffy thing. You mentioned misconceptions, right? And I think there's finally a big movement, even in the business world, to understand that this is not about making sure everyone feels good, right? Psychological safety does not mean that everyone feels so safe that we're actually comfortable. That it could not be farther from the truth. When you're talking about a psychologically safe space, it means that people feel able to step out of their comfort zone, to speak up, to have conflict, to voice and really disagree with each other, but in a respectful way that they know I'm challenging you directly, but I'm caring about you personally. I'm not doing this to be aggressive, to be an instigator, to incite more, psychological violence in the way I'm communicating with you, but I'm going to strong issue with it, but let's attack it together, and let's look at it and see what's happening here. I think that's so important. And also I would say that yes, psychological safety is so much about, Timothy Clark has a great phrase. He says psychological safety creates sanctuaries of inclusion and also incubators of innovation. And I think that's really important, because too often sometimes we focus on how it is super important, psychological safety, for well-being, your emotional needs, for your mental health, your physical health. It absolutely impacts everything. And we can't forget the other side, that we need vulnerability. We need risk-taking. We need to be able to tap fully into psych safety to reach innovation. We are living in such a time of constant change, disruption, uncertainty. It takes so much safety for an organization, for people to come together and say, we need to take a different approach. Let's get as many out of the box ideas here to how we're going to, move forward. It requires psych safety to be really innovative today.
I was listening and I was thinking about the book from Brené Brown, Daring Greatly, and the concept of rumble and the importance of rumbling together and knowing that there will be conflict, but there will be resolution. There's a safe space for conflict to show up and be handled. And even today I was listening to a small video from Adam Grant talking about the concept of work as family, and he says don't mix it up. You can call it community, it's not family. And because you're not fired from being the son of someone, it's a community, and we have to be clear with these concepts and try not to mix because it's fluffy. Also, the word is very appropriate. It's also fluffy to say, "Oh, in my work we're a family." No, you're not. You can love each other, but you're not a family.
Yeah,
I see that happening sometimes in youth work, where I come from a background where I used to work in emergency houses, and there is the habit of saying, my kids, the kids staying in these houses that we were caring for, that have their own journey, obviously, from one family maybe to another or to a different system, and we used to say, oh, but my kids this, or our kids this, and we, it took a bit of reflection for us to realize that maybe that language is not really helping neither them or us, because we're just passing by in their lives, and how other language can maybe be more appropriate and help more for the young people to process the spaces they are in. And regarding, Romy, to what you were saying, I was reminded of this quote. I don't know from who it is, but I heard it many times in the field, that safety is not it's not the absence of discomfort, it's the presence of trust.
Yes.
And I think it relates a lot to what you're saying, right? That it's not about everybody needs to feel good to learn. Not at all. We need to feel discomfort to learn, I would argue, no?
You absolutely. The learning zone is the high performance zone, actually. And, and it's the complete opposite of your comfort zone or your panic zone or your apathy zone, right? So the more comfortable we are, the more we're able to just go through things on autopilot, because we're so comfortable that we start checking out. We're not fully here. The moment that there's challenge, I think of the Goldilocks challenge stress bell. The more challenge, the more we need to be fully present. We can't miss something. So we're here, we're able to learn and grow more effectively because we're not kind of checked out, half in, half listening, half not. I also want to mention something that, threads from both of you just mentioned some really, really powerful examples. What comes up for me is about autonomy. And I think this is something so important in the learning process, is how do we give more autonomy, ownership, and agency to participants? Like you mentioned, Anita, even just thinking about the way we use language. They're not my kids or my children. They're humans in their own right, apart from me. Or even what you were mentioning, Hui, also just all of these I think what's so important when we talk about psychological safety is remembering everyone has individual agency and autonomy. And the same way we mentioned these learning zones, panic zones, comfort zones, those boundaries are going to be different for everybody. What could be in my panic zone might be thinking about if someone put me on a stage and asked me to do clowning like Anita. Oh my goodness, are you kidding me? You do not, I would probably, I don't know what would happen, but it wouldn't be pretty.
You would
Versus
love
Anita.
Clowny, I'm sure.
Anita's like, challenge accepted. I'm like, I've been stepping into applied improv, but slowly, eventually we'll get there. But I think that's important to remember, is that for what's in your comfort zone can totally be in my panic zone. I, as a youth worker, as a facilitator, as a trainer who's holding the space, have to remember that that's also going to cause some friction, where some people, the group might want to do something that for other people is completely puts them in panic. And if they're in panic, your prefrontal cortex totally shuts down, like no creativity, no innovation, no decision-making, no problem solving, no learning is going to happen. But that's why it's so important to be able to have these conversations. What do we need? What do you need as an individual to show up here and feel safer to contribute? What does the group need? And keep coming back and checking and saying, and giving them agency and ownership. This is not Romy to be controlling, hey, we didn't follow the rules, or hey, we didn't do this. It's like, are you getting what you need? Because you're in the center of this learning experience, not me.
Yeah, people learn, we don't teach, because, and that's the important part, because a lot of time we think that we're teaching, but what we are saying and what people are learning can be two completely different things. And I think it's very important to be clear that also another thing that you were mentioning, it has to stretch you. Learning, it's a stretch. Like when you exercise your muscles, it's a stretch. When you learn, it has to be a little bit demanding. Even chemical, you have to have norepinephrine, adrenaline running through to pay attention. So if you don't pay attention, you don't learn. Like you were saying, if you're on autopilot, the learning can pass you by.
Totally. You just mentioned something and I want to respond, but I already forgot my train of thought. I'm buzzing already with your comments, you all. It's really nice. Thank you.
Well, I would like to go on these misconceptions, because when we talk about non-formal education, right? Because it's the field that youth workers move more into, and I think there's a few misconceptions there about safety, or psychological safety, because I think there's a bunch of assumptions that we rely on that might not be true when we are working in this sector of non-formal learning. I will start with one, but Romy, I'm interested in what you see in the field as possible pitfalls and also how to avoid them, right? How can youth workers and trainers avoid them? One of them that I see is the use of humor. I think sometimes we have the sense that if humor is happening, everything, there's safety. It means that the group is feeling safe. And in the last years, and actually recently I had that experience just a few days ago, but I feel it also more in the last years, I've been reflecting a lot about that, how sometimes humor is based on sarcasm, which is basically a veiled critic, and how much that sometimes impacts the group, where I can sense it, how that even if it's kind of naively put by facilitators or by participants, how sometimes that kind of makes people startle in their chairs, because it feels like, oh, are we allowed? Is this okay? Is it okay that we are referring to things with this specific kind of humor? I don't know. What's your take on that?
Oh, such a good point. And the first thing that came to mind was, I myself remember very early on in my own journey, one of the first training courses I went to with Erasmus Plus, and as a participant, the trainer in front of us, he was very, had a lot of experience, very professional, really great trainer. But what I remember was the deeply uncomfortable cringe of the humor, because for me, it took a very sexist tone. And that's what I remember, right? Because our brains remember more the emotional experiences. So I actually recently, after years, just ran into him and saw him, and it was like, ooh, like I was like, okay, Romy, this is a good moment to check your bias, because just because he was making those jokes back then doesn't mean. But I think you're absolutely right that humor, sometimes we misconstrue fun as like a need that we have to have, so we have to bring fun, but sometimes learning doesn't always have to be fun sometimes. And you're talking to someone who, one of the ways that I was able to create innovation in my human trafficking prevention trainings was by bringing more fun and play into a topic that seems completely so serious you would never want to have fun and play. But humor is different to me, because humor is about very much your own subjective approach, and can, as you mentioned, can take hints of sarcasm or even just subtle undertones that can actually create a lot more, can be felt by different groups as more of a microaggression than really feeling like you're bringing fun in. So I think that as facilitators, we do need to really also check our own, it's our biases, it's our humor, it's how we show up, because you're right that when you mentioned earlier, if you're on the scale who wants to be more neutral, humor can really divide people so instantly. Or notice if someone said, oh, they're making jokes about this, I don't want to then share, if they're making sexist jokes, I don't want to say anything as a woman. I don't want to continue to perpetuate, those stereotypes. So I think that's a really great point to mention. And the other ones that come to, sorry, I'm like,
no, go ahead, because I totally agree with you. I just wanted to add that for me, for people who know me and the way I work, my style, it's something just I believe a lot of enjoy as the drive of my working as facilitator. But that doesn't mean that it has to be fun all the time. It cannot be discomfortable. It has to be pleasant all the time, or it has to. But joy, I think, is a different thing. It's how do you bring positivity, and some lightness when possible, to make things feel safer, actually. But it doesn't have to be on based on jokes or being funny or having the attention on my humor or whatever I'm saying. Yes,
totally.
But there's another dimension that I feel that was left out from your reflections on humor, is when people don't feel safe, they use humor as a mask, so they don't have to really show themselves.
Sometimes that's what's going on. Sometimes people are not.
And that if you feel safe, maybe you can be more vulnerable. And being vulnerable for a lot of people is crying, and it's not making jokes. And usually when people are making jokes, they're trying to ease the discomfort that I feel. If everyone's laughing at what I'm saying, I'm okay.
It's so. And I think we see this a lot in youth work when you're working with youngsters, like the typical stereotypical like class clown. Yeah. That's exactly it.
That's
for a long time, we used to call them crocodiles. Or like, oh, they're gonna come in, they're gonna make humor. Their goal is to distract the whole group. It's super disruptive. But you're so right. If you look deeper at the psychological needs, what's happening is someone saying, I don't feel fully comfortable to be fully vulnerable and transparent myself. I'm masking something, or there's usually like something I found deeper on, like needing to feel seen there. Mm-hmm. They need to come in because they need to be seen. So whereas early on in my training career, I probably would have been like, I like this participant, and now I've learned to like take them aside and say like, hey, like what's going on, and recognizing that most of those cases was someone who felt that they already had a lot of experience or knowledge, but they just needed a partner to help see them. And then I'd say, okay, what can you contribute? Do you want to co-facilitate with me? Would you like to offer your own session? And all of a sudden, when they were given this spotlight, they took it really seriously, because they felt this is not now, I don't, yes, they can bring their humor, but they felt finally seen that they could contribute in a way versus feeling like they were always kind of put in the masses or not able to contribute what they really could. So I totally agree with you.
It's also being seen in character, and that's the difficult part, because when people don't want to be seen in their vulnerability, They want they really, a deeper need is they really want to be seen in their vulnerabilities, but they can only show the character.
Ooh, interesting.
Yeah, that could be.
And I think this topic, like you mentioned, what are these common misconceptions? And you mentioned vulnerability, because I think that's another one. I think there is a misconception from trainers or facilitators or youth workers that as long as people are vulnerable, then their safety here. And sometimes in that attempt to create space for people to be vulnerable, we sometimes force it. And I even have started calling this like vulnerability porn, kind of like poverty porn, where you used to see like these advertisements, right? Save children in Africa. So, and really re-exploiting marginalized individuals and communities and groups in the sake of donations. Now we see this, I think, with vulnerability. It's like, we have to break the ice. We have to go in. So all of a sudden you throw people way too fast, too soon. That does not create safety. In fact, what it does is have people check out and say, this is not, I just went to an event and a conference. There's like 150 people there. The very first prompt at the very beginning is turn to your partner and share one of your deepest failures. Like, this is how you open. And I went, oh my gosh, no. And I get that it's not to criticize or shame, because there is I get that there's a positive intention there, thinking that the more people open up, the more they will feel safe. But unfortunately, when we don't ease in, when we don't create that experience to make it a journey, right? Yes, gradual vulnerability over time so people can open up more and more layers. If they feel that they are thrown in too soon, they check out. There's no learning is going to happen there. And we need to be really careful as trainers, facilitators, youth workers in how do we gradually increase vulnerability? How do we also create opportunities for choice and autonomy, right? You don't have to share your deepest failure. Share a mistake, a mishap, or something, but you have choice. I might even say on a scale of 1 to 10, since negativity bias, our brain wants to go to the 10, the worst failure, maybe stick to a 6, or, something that might have been a mishap, just to give people more choice that they can. And sometimes I even say, like, if you're not comfortable sharing this, then share what you learned through this activity, right? Because I do a lot of, self-reflection, and some people say, oh, this was so personal, I don't want to share this. So we always say, like, turn to your partner and share what you wrote. No, I say, if that feels too vulnerable, share what you learned through this activity, right? You have more choice. That is so important for safety.
Absolutely.
Going to the conference was the biggest mistake those people made.
No, it was a good conference. It was just not the great opening prompt.
Yeah. What's your biggest mistake? Coming here.
Are you being the class clown right now?
Sorry. I really want to be seen.
We see you. Our listeners don't, because it's only audio, but we actually have a Zoom video right now, so we see each other. And yes, no, I wanted to agree with you, Romy. It's this idea. Yeah, I think sometimes in non-formal education, we say it maybe once in the beginning of a training or a week, like, activities are optional. It's challenge by choice. You take as much as you can and you feel comfortable, although challenge yourself, But sometimes we don't even say that. But I think we don't say it enough. And sometimes we don't have the words to explain it in the moment. And I like what you said, that when you are giving instructions for a specific exercise that might be a bit more demanding in terms of exposing yourself or taking risk, or that we can say that, like, pace yourself in a way that you are sharing, if you feel still safe, even if it's deep. And I like what you just put it on a scale for people to understand. I like this. I'm a fan of words and how we word things, because I think that shapes the space and it shapes the learning environment, and giving people these simple options, especially with young people that might not yet have the resources or the confidence to really analyze, like, how much will what I'm going to share is actually contributing to my learning and to this conversation. So I love what you just said, giving choices, and I think giving them often. So not just saying in the beginning, this is non-formal learning, so you know the drill, you share. but putting those options often on the table. No.
I completely agree. And I think it's, again, I go back to the learning as a partnership. It's really important that we as youth workers and facilitators, I think, especially when we've been in this space for decades, we can get so jaded. We use this language a lot. This is the drill. Okay, we've done enough fears, expectations, contribution, right? But we forget that for many of our youth, this is the first time they've experienced. They don't know a lot of those nuances. And so we need to be really tapped into creating as many different opportunities for them to, for example, for us to get feedback, right? It's also a misconception to say, oh, the worst. This is a safe space. So come and anytime you need, like, tell me what you need and give feedback. Please do not say and state this is a safe space. That might be a safe space for you, but that doesn't necessarily mean it is for everyone there. They don't know it.
And just because you state it doesn't mean it becomes.
Absolutely. It means nothing when you say it. We create safety in our actions. And so showing up and saying, hey, here's an anonymous feedback box. You can also come and talk to me if you prefer to give verbal. There's also this person or this other structure or mechanism, different ways to give feedback depending on what you feel comfortable with, because I really do value, different ways. The same way that we cater a lot of the spaces that we're in to extroverts, and whoever's voice is here, but how do we intentionally create more space that everyone is first individually self-reflecting, has time to process, then we can either, put Post-its up or hear from some people or use different conversation formats. So still we're getting everyone's voice in the room in different ways, but in a way that creates more opportunities for more people to come in.
And I was thinking about the sharing the biggest failure. The recipient of the failure might not be able to handle what comes up. And that's also tricky. Imagine in your vulnerability scale, you go to the 10 and the other person is not ready to receive, she will panic or something, and it will be even worse than not sharing anything.
Yes. That's such a good point. I think, again, we often forget as facilitators because we're used to holding space. We forget that our youth and even other educators or trainers, they don't always have the tools to know how to respond. So giving prompts, I often do, like just what you mentioned, I would say, not just give the storytelling prompt, but also when you're in the listener, like, please don't respond. I invite you to just, when person A finishes, take a collective breath together, or give a sentence stem, like, hearing that, I feel ... or whatever that is, because you're so right. Some people don't know, and they can do a lot more harm than good, feeling like they need to jump in, they need to one up, or they need to tell their story. Yeah, it's a recipe for issues.
We are talking more and more here about, working with young people, and I like this idea of maybe trying to think, is there differences that you feel being in the field for so long as I have been, and who are you being a father as well, and working in different capacity now with young people as well as a sports psychologist. Do you feel the new generations coming in bring different needs to the learning space, or they communicate them differently? Do you feel this difference between how people used to behave in learning spaces, 15, 20 years ago and now?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's a combination. I mean, for sure it can be a generational thing. I think also COVID, we don't talk enough about how COVID has impacted and affected us. For example, regardless, I've just noticed trainings before COVID, after COVID, there's much less attention span. Like, I think that COVID was such a collectively traumatic event for so many people that we don't even realize it. But our attention span, I noticed that, like, our typical, youth work trainings days, I'm like, oh, no, we have to have 3 sessions in a day. 4 is just way too much now. People can't physically handle it. But when you talk about the generational stuff, absolutely. I think what I'm seeing is not necessarily that there's, this generation has this need or this, which I do see a lot of prints and material on, but I think it's more about how that manifests, right? Like, if we look at the pillars of psychological safety, we know that people need what Amy Edmondson says, they need inclusion and diversity. We need open conversation. We need willingness to help. We need attitude, like an open attitude towards risk and failure. These are pillars that we absolutely need. But how those manifest are going to be totally different. Like if you think about open communication, for somebody who's from an older generation would just probably pick up the phone and call someone. Oh my gosh, young people, are you kidding me? Pick up the phone, not texting, no, right? So I think it's even more important to think about how are we including, and how are we and reaching them out and using their platforms, right? How do you have open communication conversation via text is very different than via, face to face or via a phone call. How do we also make sure that, in this, young people are like constantly at this point, 24/7, their phone is an extension of their fingers, right? So how do we create, I think my generation is very much like if you walk into a training room, it's okay to put your phone down or in a phone box and you leave it there because you're stepping in. First, for a lot of young people, that feels very unsafe. Their phone is a safety mechanism for them to be connected. The moment that you ask people, take your phone away, no phones here, you also are shutting them down from something that could be a safety net. So how do you work with it and how do you co-create and how do you discuss what makes me feel safe versus like if I'm having a deep conversation, someone's on their phone, I don't feel seen. But how do we also make sure we're recognizing, as you were mentioning earlier, Hui, like sometimes that's also a mask when it feels like there's too much emotions. I need to disconnect. I need to go back into social media just to have a moment to refresh. How do we create more conversations around all those needs? I think is really important.
Definitely. I like what two things that you said that strike me. First of all, because currently we are working on this project about Gen Z and Gen A and what is their preferences in learning spaces. And I like what you said, that it's not about them as if these humans are now born differently. It is the context they were born into, the society they were born into that changed. And therefore, their behavior in learning spaces changed. Their circumstances are different. Their upbringing was a different world. And that's what changed. So it's not about labeling, because we were talking about this before recording. And Romy, you were saying like sometimes it's labeling. It's not, it's a generalization that is not so cool, which I agree. It's about recognizing how the world is changing and therefore people learn differently, or they are now used to learning differently, or they, like you said, they have relationships with spaces, interactions and technology that are different. And I love that, to underline that. And the second thing that you were saying, which is about maybe what we need is to learn to have different conversations that were not needed 20 years ago. And now they are needed, and they're also educational for the learner, which is, okay, you maybe need, if it gets overwhelming, we tend to go to the mobile phone. Is that a good thing for your learning? Is that a negative thing for you? Is it needed? Is it more of an addiction that we all have now, and it's just an easy way out, or is it actually something okay because you can handle it and you can come back after a few minutes? So when is it okay to use it? I like this idea that maybe as educators, youth workers, we need to learn to have new conversations.
I think it's a both and. It's being able to have these new conversations and also going back to the roots and the source of what we know, again, of how people learn. Like I want to come back to one of the things of why I am so passionate about experiential learning is precisely you were mentioning earlier, Hui, that we all can have the exact same experience, but we're going to have totally different takeaways. And I love that. That's part of experience bias. It can be a good thing, sometimes a negative thing, right? But I love that about experiential learning is that we create space for that. And in today's, I'm making an assumption here, but I'm assuming that in today's, like, most young people I know who are in school, they're all using ChatGPT. Why think for myself when I have someone who's going to give me the right answer? I think we're going to see even more and more with this generation and unwillingness to fail forward, but always to constantly look for the right answer from external sources. And for me, it comes back to experiential learning. I always say, You can tell me you hated this activity. You can tell me you loved it. You can tell me anything. I don't care as long as it's your honest experience. How do you feel about this? What do you think? Mining for opposites. Who you said this, Anita, you had a totally different perspective. There's space for all of that. And so I would say it's yes, we need to have new conversations. And we also need to remember that the foundation of what, a non-formal education, experiential learning is based on is so needed today now more than ever to bring all those different critical thinking, diverse perspectives in the room.
And also, I had this conversation the other day. I was in the car with my oldest daughter and two friends. And sometimes we need to point things without judgment. And I was saying, oh, you're always so friendly and so loving and a lot of emojis when you're texting. But when you get to the present of each other, you're very shy. That we didn't have that. You can be very emotional using the emojis, but when you get face to face with people, do you shy away? And they were like shocked and, oh, it's true. We also need to point that out because they're not seeing, because they grew up. It's like the David Foster Wallace, what is water? Because if you grew up in water, you don't recognize water. And exactly. It's up to us that we've seen what is water and what is not water to point, this is water. And you're swimming in emoji lands, and you should bring that emotional beyond the emoji. And I mentioned emoji a lot. Sorry.
And no, I love it because I tie it back to psych safety in a way of, it's exactly what you said. The context and the environment that we're in is absolutely the most significant factor in our behaviors in any space. So when you think about psych safety, this is why another misconception is often that once you have it, it's done. But actually, it's something that's constantly changing and evolving based on who's coming in the environment, who's coming out, how I might feel safe in this environment with the two of you. But if one new person comes in all of a sudden, I might totally not know who they are and not feel comfortable to share. Or, if I'm operating with different teams, right? With one team, I might feel really safe, with another not. So it's so true. I work with neuroscientists, and I love Dr. Marcia Goddard. She's wonderful. She says, our environment changes our brain, which changes our environment changes our behaviors, which change our brain, and our brain then in turn changes the environment, which changes. So it's this never ending cycle, because you're so right. That environment will totally shift our behaviors, which will totally shift our own neural pathways. And that's why we need to be aware of what are the contexts that we're operating in, and what does safety mean that's different in all these contexts with different groups. It's not going to be one size fits all. It's going to be very, very different.
Yeah.
I would have one last question about this topic of the new generations, and then we need to start moving on to the end of the conversation, which I would definitely stay here and talk more. But I hear a lot of youth workers and other people, other educators saying, well, this is their criticism towards the new generations. They are so sensitive. We can't say anything anymore because nowadays, everybody gets offended, and they're, I don't know, they're, people call them snowflakes. They say like they're too fragile, and whatever. They need to toughen up. What's your take on this critique, that this intergenerational critique I feel from the older generation to the new generations?
Yes, I know. I kind of straddle different generations who are having these kinds of conversations. I think it's really important to remember that we go back to psychological safety doesn't mean that comfort. And unfortunately, one of the ways that I've seen younger generations start to weaponize psychological safety is when they're having a feedback conversation, when they're having a more difficult or more challenging, uncomfortable conversation with maybe an employer or someone in more of a position of power, and shutting down and saying, I don't feel safe here. So if you start to weaponize safety and say, I don't feel safe here, and someone from an older generation then feels like, ooh, then I've done something now harm. Unfortunately, what we've done is create a huge divide where people feel like, oops, they either feel called out, they either feel canceled, right? We feel like the conversation shuts down and there's no more. And what I've been suggesting to those of an older generation would say to ask and really show up with curiosity and say, what about this conversation is making you unsafe? And I'd say the same thing should go in any kind of context. How do we show up with more curiosity instead of judgment? I know it's very hard to do, but it's a great practice. How do we show up more as emotion scientists to try to see, like, I'm really trying to understand what's the feeling, but also what's the action that has instigated this? What can we learn from this? Right? It sounds so trivial, but how do we call people more in versus calling them out? Because it's inevitable that hurt is going to be caused in it doesn't matter about generations. Like, it's an inevitable that if we've worked together enough, at some point, conflict is going to show up. And I think the challenge is that we don't plan for it. We actually try to do everything to minimize conflict. And instead, when it shows up, we don't know what to do. But instead, if we say from the beginning, how do we prime onboarding conversations with different generations on, like, how do you prefer to receive feedback? What did your culture teach you about how has your culture impacted how you relate to conflict? How do we, when conflict erupts between us, because it's an inevitable, how should we address it? And being able to have these open conversations where people say, I'm not coming in with judgment, I'm trying to blame, I'm just really focused on our relationship is in the center to make sure we can collaborate better. But it's not easy
you phrased that so well. I think you phrased that so well. It's really about also building capacity for discomfort within the group and within the relationship, and within ourselves as well, by the way. But it's not just about judging others for the new ways they communicate and the new awareness that also new generations come with new awarenesses that I think are great about their mental health, about, they can name some processes much better than, at least when I grew up in my reality. But that also then sometimes comes with the other side of the coin, which is sometimes we need to build a bit of capacity for discomfort.
And one thing that's very important that I've found in my personal life, and I'm seeing more and more with young people also, is if you explain the possibility of repairing relationships, because they feel that once you mess up, it's done. And it goes back to the rumble. When you rumble, it gets messy, but you clean it up. And the ability to repair relationships that might have struggled in this area or that area gives you the confidence to go into the fight, because we'll match up, we'll make up at the end. Yeah.
I think that's such an intuitive and very insightful point to mention. And I'm sure that has to do with the generational social media, right? Like follow, unfollow. You're here, you're canceled, right? It's like so much of these end of the spectrums are black or white. And I think you made a great point that even framing a conversation, why I'm asking you these questions is because I really care about our partnership and our relationship. And I want to make sure that we can move forward together. And if people understand that there is a real intention for repair, you're less likely to be like, whatever, screw them. I don't ever need to speak to them again. But like, let's actually be vulnerable and talk about it so we can work forward together. Such a great point.
Yeah, and people can say, I messed up.
Yeah, totally. Even just not being defensive, right? Just saying, I had no idea that this joke or this, language or this word, I had no idea that this could be a trigger. Like, thank you so much. I really want to get better at making sure I, rethink the way I'm communicating, but feel free to keep holding me accountable to it, right? It doesn't, it again is a partnership. Doesn't mean now all the onus is on me. It's like, no, I'm going to try, but I've been speaking this way for decades. So please help me because I really want to work on this. It is important to me.
Yeah. Yes. And like that, we are also modeling vulnerability actually for our participant or young people, if that's the case.
Totally.
Great. One last question from our side, and this is actually not from us, but from our previous guest. This is a tradition we have. So, Hui, shout away. What is the question our previous guest left for Romy?
The question is, what is unlearning for you?
Yes, I think it's a great question, right? We need to unlearn before we learn. For me, when I think about unlearning, it's really the visual image, it's gonna be a long answer, but I promise I'll try and keep it short. But the visual in my head is, when I think about our neural pathways, I love that someone gave me this example of like, if you're in a forest, we continue to do the same things. In one forest, we might have this path really deeply grained that anyone can see it. But there might be a lot of other paths that we haven't walked down, so they're not as well developed. And for me, when I think about unlearning, it's really staying off that very well-cleared path that I've gone down 100 times, that's become a pattern that maybe I'm even in autopilot, and really trying to backtrack and say, how could I take a different approach? How could I, I've learned this is a pattern, this is a preference, this is how I show up, but is it really serving me? And how can I try something different and new, walk down a new path in the forest and see how it might lead to a different result or outcome? And I think we should all try constantly to be very aware of what are those patterns and also what are new approaches, so we can create new pathways, new learning forward.
Yeah, and I was thinking, when you get the wheels on the rut, it's you have to put energy to come out of the rut.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
It's not easy. It's hard. It is so hard to unlearn those patterns. Like, oh, I'm in the thick of it myself. But, I realize I'm going to be a better person, better trainer, youth worker, human, if I start really unlearning those unhealthy patterns or behaviors and start to learn new ones and new approaches. It's actually freeing, painful, but it can be freeing.
Yeah. Yes. So we need you to leave a question for our next guest.
Ooh, about psychological safety.
Whatever you
about
want.
Psychological safety, youth work, innovation, new generations, whatever you want.
Cooking tips is not allowed.
I would ask someone, I don't know if this is too vulnerable, but they have choice. Remind them they have full choice. What do you need to feel safe and show up as your best self?
Wow, that's very nice. That's very nice. Thank you, Romy. Thank you so much. I want to thank you for the time you took with us today to talk about these hot topics, and I'm also very passionate about them, and you obviously too, and you have so much expertise to share. Thank you so much. Thank you, Rui, as well, for sharing this conversation and building this conversation with us. And I wish you all the best in your new adventures, and I'm so interested in these projects you talked about. I think I'm going to call you right after.
Yes, let's have a catch up. Yes, I love these topics. I can talk about psychological safety, experiential learning, whenever, however. So if anyone who's ever listens in on this podcast wants to find me on LinkedIn, feel free. I can literally talk about it nonstop. And with you too, Anita, we can have a chat right after this, whatever you need.
Thank you. Just reminding our listeners, Romy puts out very nice articles about all these topics. We will share the link to your Medium, and also, Rui, if you can also share some of the references we talked about, Daring Greatly, maybe any other topics any of the books you've mentioned. We put them on the link, so it makes it easier for our listeners to safely but bravely pursue this learning path. Awesome. Thank you so much, Romy. Thank you, Rui.
Thank you. Thank you all so much.
This podcast was brought to you by Team Mais, recorded and edited by Rui Branco for the international project Inception of Learning, financed by the Erasmus Plus program. Our great partners for this project are the associations Fundacja Instytut Innowacji from Poland, Jasna Idnina from North Macedonia, and Odd Socks from Montenegro.